Hello everyone, and welcome to BSL Talks. I'm Dina Bowman, Principal Research Fellow, Work and Economic Security at the Brotherhood of St. Laurence. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we work and live. I pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders past, present and emerging. And I particularly acknowledge the many lands from which we have gathered today. I'm speaking to you from Wadawurrung country in regional Victoria. Our panellists join us from Wurundjeri country, Bungarong country, Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I have with me Amber and Nick, our Auslan interpreters for the day. Closed captioning is also available by clicking the CC button at the bottom of the screen, and Carrie is our closed captioner today. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website after today. If you have a question during the event for our panellists, please use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of the screen. We'll have a lot of people dialed in, so we mightn't be able to answer all the questions due to the limited time available, but we'll try our best. The chat feature is also on if you wish to make any comments or join the conversation. And if you're tweeting, we encourage you to do so. Please use the hashtag BSL Talks and please tag Brotherhood Info. For those of you who may be new to the work of the Brotherhood of St. Laurence, we're a social justice organisation working alongside people experiencing disadvantage to address the fundamental causes of poverty in Australia. Our work is directly informed by people experiencing poverty and disadvantage, using evidence drawn from our research and program experience to develop practical solutions to create lasting change. Today, we're using the most recent Life Chances report as a springboard for discussion about intergenerational equity. The Life Chances study began in 1990, some 32 years ago. Before introducing our expert panel, I'd like to ask Janet Taylor, one of the original researchers, to reflect on the study. I'll then ask Dr. Ursula Harrison, our current Life Chances Research Fellow, to briefly highlight some of the study's most recent findings. But first to Janet. Janet has had a long career in social research, both in academia and in the welfare sector. She has undertaken a range of studies on immigrants and refugees, health needs, young people, unemployment, and attitudes to poverty. She was a senior research fellow at BSL from 1988 until 2015, and an honorary senior fellow at the University of Melbourne. One of her major projects at BSL was the Life Chances study, on which she worked from its inception in 2019. So I'll hand over to Janet now.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I've been asked to introduce the Life Chances study, and it really is amazing to be here 32 years after the study started. I think there were four factors that the study grew out of. The Brotherhood of St. Laurence was running a national campaign to end child poverty in Australia. In the 80s, Prime Minister Bob Hawke promised that no child in Australia would live in poverty by 1990. There were the films of the British 7-Up series, which showed the diverse lives of a small group of children over time. And there were also large-scale longitudinal studies of children growing up. Our aim was to look at children born in 1990 and see over time how they fared in terms of family income, poverty, and other factors. We didn't have the resources to do an Australia-wide study, but we could start on our doorstep in Fitzroy. Here there were babies being born to young single mothers, to refugee families in the high-rise public housing, and to young professional women in the terrace houses of Fitzroy. The study began in 1990 with interviews with mothers of 167 babies. We wanted to look at the lives of children born in very much the same place at the same time, but to diverse families, and to ask about their life chances. We explored many aspects of their lives, but always with a focus on the implications for social policy. We kept in contact with families as they moved away from the inner suburbs. I guess I've had some involvement in the first 11 stages of this study. There have been lots of reports, a book, 3 films, and I must congratulate Dina and Ursula on the most recent report. And I do want to thank all those who've participated in the study, the mothers who shared their early experiences, the fathers, the young people who grew up with us asking them to reflect on their lives, some of whom valued this and some of whom I think remained a bit bemused by it. So what is the value of a long-running study such as the Life Chances study? For me, one of the main values is in the stories of the individuals, highlighting the diversity of experiences and outcomes and preventing us becoming too seduced by stereotypes and generalities. The talk of boomers and millennials is of limited use in developing actual policies for an inclusive society. We saw examples of so-called intergenerational disadvantage, but also of change, of families and individuals who moved in and out of poverty. The families at all income levels experience stressful life events, but those low-income families experienced many more of these. The study also illustrates the resilience of individuals related to a combination of personal traits, family support, and importantly, to social supports. So what are the changes that have affected their life chances over the years? In Fitzroy in 1990, men worked in Broadmeadows car factories and women worked in local clothing factories. The demise of manufacturing industries is one aspect of a very changed job market. And what of social supports? Some that were available in the 1990s have been eroded since. Income support, such as Job Seeker, provides less adequate support now than it did then for those without jobs of whatever age group. Public housing was a valuable resource for some of the families. How available is it now? Education costs have increased, and we saw the new era of digital disadvantage arrive. We saw the young take on the mantra of you need a good education to get a good job, but this didn't always deliver. When we think of intergenerational equity, we need to remember the stories of the young people in low-income families who work to help their parents financially to pay rent and to pay off mortgages. We need these stories as well as those of the mum and dad bank. So Bob Hawke's promise wasn't enough to end child poverty over time. As a society, we need a major reinvest in income support and social housing for all age groups in need. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. It's great for you to be able to provide that long sort of perspective across the study. I'd like now to introduce Dr. Ursula Harrison, our Life Chances Research Fellow, to provide a brief overview of the study's most recent findings.
Great, thanks, Dina. And I'd also like to give many thanks to the participants of the Life Chances study, particularly in this stage 12. In stage 12, provided us with intergenerational insights into economic security across 2 generations, that of a small group of parents and some of the Life Chances participants. What we found was an ongoing reliance by many on the family safety net that was quite different from the parents. Some could lean on their privilege by turning to the family safety net when experiencing economic insecurity. But economic and social changes over the past 30 years have had uneven impacts and those without resource-rich networks were much more vulnerable to these impacts. The more precarious labour market, some of the drivers of uneven impacts were the more precarious labour market in Australia that has increased levels of insecure work and the length of time it can take to enter stable employment. Underemployment has increased, and that has left many working in areas not commensurate with their qualifications. Again, a stark contrast to a lot of the parents, and working for less hours than they needed. In the arts, hospitality, and community services, it was often necessary to have more than 2 jobs. Some had 3. Overall, very few had been in stable employment for more than 5 years. An increasingly inadequate and conditional income support system has seen unemployment payments increasing in real terms only once during the life of this study, and that was the $40 per fortnight increase in early 2021. Both generations appreciated income support when it was needed, particularly if they were unemployed or out of work while parenting. But the 30-year-olds now encounter an increasingly conditional and punitive system with inadequate payments, and that has left some to forego income to which they have been and were entitled. The retreating dream of home ownership has pushed aspirations for their own home into the future or completely out of scope, particularly for those who have struggled to keep a roof over their heads. Just trying to cover the rent and bills didn't leave many much opportunity to save. Even with secure employment, the widening ratio between median house prices and median per capita income made it much harder to save, and it certainly involves a higher financial risk. Financial well-being has been undermined by income and employment precarity, and this has made it difficult to accrue a savings buffer. We asked about the 12 months before the study, and some had been unable to pay rent or mortgage payments and utility bills. They juggled living costs by reducing expenditure where they could. Some went without meals. They sold or pawned items or sought help from external agencies or their families. So the family safety net, it provided employment during extended periods of study or during prolonged transitions to secure employment, or until gaining regular and reliable income. Sometimes families provided loans or financial gifts to meet unexpected large bills. And for many, families were able to provide no or low cost accommodation during periods of income and employment precarity, illness, or while they saved for a house deposit. And families also helped towards home ownership through becoming guarantors for home loans or by providing large financial gifts when and where they could. Policies that have encouraged a reliance on the family safety net have become more increasing over the last 30 years. And our concern with this is that policies that have explicitly or implicitly encouraged a reliance on the family safety net are inherently unequal. Thanks, Dina.
Thanks for sharing that overview, Ursula. Now to our panel of experts. First, please welcome Dr. Liz Allen. Liz is an award-winning demographer at the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods, and was named among the ABC top humanitarians and social science academics in Australia in 2018. She's a regular media commentator for all things demography. Professor Roger Wilkins is Deputy Director of the Melbourne Institute and Deputy Director Research of the Hilda Study, which releases an annual statistical survey report on household income and labour dynamics in Australia. And Ruby Mountford is an award-winning advocate, public speaker and writer living on Wurundjeri land, whose work in the LGBTIQA+ and disability inclusion spans project management, research, media engagement, co-design, facilitation, consultation with local, state and federal governments. Ruby is currently working in community health as an inclusion consultant and serves as the Vice President of the Melbourne Bisexual Network and as Administration Officer for Pride Foundation Australia. Ruby also has participated in the Life Chances study. So first to you, Liz. You've said that inequality starts before birth. Can you explain this and how this contributes to intergenerational inequality?
Yeah, privilege and disadvantage is something that starts before we're born. It's gifted to us. Our social standing, our socioeconomic perhaps potential in life is gifted at birth, comes from our parents and influences a whole suite of opportunities and so on throughout our life course. And of course, it's not just about socioeconomic status. Our health is a significant outcome of our privilege or disadvantage, our education, to all sorts of things. But I think the most striking for me is life expectancy, where you live and your socioeconomic status collide and mean that we see quite stark mortality experiences when it comes to inequality. And I think that if it's difficult to really convince someone that inequality is real, I think you just need to talk about the fact that people who are disadvantaged live a shorter life on average. So it's not destiny though. Just because we know that on average this occurs, one is not destined with a particular life path ahead of them. But we know that socioeconomic status from the moment we're born impacts, say, for example, early learning, our school education, to our post-school education, to our employment, to our housing, and so on. So it's pretty important from the very moment we're conceived that policy has a role in equalising outcomes and supporting people. And I say this not just as a researcher, but with someone as lived experience. We heard earlier from Janet and Ursula about the BSL project and this 30-year longitudinal data collection, a qualitative data collection. And that's quite extraordinary. We don't tend to hear stories from people over such a long period of time about their transitions through life. We tend to rely on quantitative data. And among the quantitative data, I'm seen as a deviant case study. So I'm from disadvantage. I have experienced institutional sexual abuse. I became homeless as a teenager. I experienced poverty and extreme disadvantage as a result of that. I had a daughter at the age of 17 and then decided, after all of that, being a high school dropout and so on, that, it was the birth of my daughter that made me realise that I needed to get life on track, if not for me, for her. The difficulty was that I needed opportunities. And this is the key. This is the key lever when it comes to policy, is that we need to understand these so-called deviant studies, the studies that don't follow the known trend when it comes to disadvantage and so on. So what it was for me was education was my passport to life. I was just lucky. I managed to fall in with a great bunch of educators at Mount Druitt TAFE, and they helped support me and made me realise that I wasn't the problem, that society had a problem, and that that there were opportunities to be made, and I was worthy of being included in society. And that, for me, elevated me beyond a point where my life was destiny and my life was destined to be quite horrible. And then from that, I now have 7 kids. I think I'm in a pretty decent job. I think I've turned it around somewhat. But my life paints quite an important story for policy and for that transmission of not only intra-generational disadvantage, but intergenerational disadvantage. And why we need to be cautious about the generational wars. There's nothing to be won by arguing around whether a boomer or a millennial or a Gen X or a Gen Y has things tougher. We have to first recognise what the state of play is, and we don't tend to collect data in a way that helps us understand that for I guess, real actionable policy. We definitely have the Hilda study, which Roger will talk about, but these qualitative stories about us as Australians and what it means to live during a time and in a place where we are confronted with growing inequality. I'm faced with the prospect, even though I feel like I've turned my life around, with not being able to buy a home. And so I then gift my birth inequality to my children. And that frightens me. And it shouldn't be like that. You know, we're told if we have a go, we'll get a go. I tell you what, there are a whole heap of people having a red hot go at it and not being supported. So we really need to shift focus and think about these opportunities that will help support people achieve a meaningful existence, a meaningful life of their choosing. And through data, we can achieve that. And I'm so proud to be seeing the release of this enormous report from the Brotherhood of St. Laurence, because it enables us to have conversations about what it means for policy and destiny and intergenerational inequality and how we can fight it.
Thanks so much, Liz. It's great to get your insights, not only from lived experience, but also as a demographer. It's very valuable points that you made. Turning to you now, Roger, as Deputy Director of the Hilda study, can you explain the apparently contradictory phenomena of increased intergenerational inequality and at the same time the persistence of advantage and disadvantage?
Yeah, thanks, Dina, and hello to everyone, and thank you for having me along today. So, the Hilda survey, for those of you who don't know, is in some ways a little like the Life Chances study, in that it's longitudinal, but we didn't start until 2001, and I guess you could say we go for increased quantity but with less depth on each respondent. So we have 17,000 people from right across the country in our sample, and we're interviewing them annually, and we're also following. It's designed to be infinitely lived, because we follow the children of our original sample members and their children, and so on. And I think the first thing I would just note is that there's nothing in the Life Chances study that surprises me from what I see in Hilda. It's very consistent with. It's deeper, so there's a lot more. There's a lot more detail to the story from the Life Chances study, but the things that the issues that are identified there are very much in evidence in the Hilda survey, to the extent that we can examine those things. Now, what the study is finding is that overall measures of income inequality have been relatively stable over the last 20 years, but this belies some really, I guess, concerning trends that are happening when it comes to the distribution of economic well-being and the prevalence and persistence and transmission of disadvantage. And Denny, you mentioned in particular two elements, which was an apparent growth in what we've called an intergenerational divide. So that is where we're basically seeing younger people relative to older people, and I guess I'll refrain from referring to them by generational terms, like, but we are seeing that relative to older people, younger people are not as well off now as they were, say, 20 years ago. So so there has been this shift, and it's in terms of both things like income, but also wealth, which is very much connected to what's going on in the housing market. But also in terms of things like ability to get good career jobs and so forth. We are seeing that's there's always to some extent a divide, but it's been growing over time. But at the same time, we're also seeing we also see what we could call intergenerational transmission of advantage and disadvantage. And I guess you've raised the question of, well, how do we reconcile that? Well, the thing to note is that while on average older people are doing better relative to younger people, there's still lots of variation within each age group. There's lots of people doing not so well, and there's plenty of people doing well at the same time. And so that leaves enormous scope for transmission to their children of their advantage or disadvantage. And in fact, the rise in a proportion of older people who are relatively wealthy is possibly exacerbating this intergenerational transmission of advantage and disadvantage. We've all, well, I think Liz, you might have alluded to the bank of mum and dad. The role that might be playing in perpetuating advantage, but conversely, the other side of that coin is that we're seeing increased transmission of disadvantage. The other thing I just want, which you didn't mention, which I just want to allude to, is the other concerning trend we are seeing in the Hilda survey data is increased persistence at the individual level in both advantage and disadvantage. So to put it in simple terms, if you're in poverty in it 1 year, your chances of being in poverty in the next year have increased relative over the course of the last 2 decades. So you're more likely to stay in that state, and so that to me is also I guess an alarming trend that I think is probably not well appreciated in the broader community.
Thanks, Roger. Now, a final question before I'm going to open it up a bit to Ruby. Can you reflect on the challenges facing young people of your age, especially in relation to employment, economic security, and, as Roger flagged, the issues around housing?
Hi. Firstly, I want to also just quickly acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, where I'm coming in from, pay my respects to elders past and present. And I think also acknowledge that any work we're doing to try and tackle inequity needs to be centering the traditional custodians of Australia. I think I mentioned that because my perspective is on the difference in story. I suppose I do a lot of work in social spaces and in communities that don't have a lot of representation. And I suppose that kind of makes me think of the stories that we tell ourselves, and the biggest cause of the generational wars that we kind of see breaking out isn't a misunderstanding about the price of avocados, but more a difference in the story that we're being told we should be living and what we're experiencing. And I suppose that comes into when we talk about things like job insecurity and housing and the disappearing dream. And I think that's a fair thing to say. Our dreams are disappearing faster than the Amazon rainforest. What I mean by that is we know that in the recession in the 90s and then again in 2007, I mean, I turned of age the year that we saw banks and unchecked greed crash the world's economies. And studies have shown that from there in Australia, while Australia did not experience recession, everyone under 25 did and has continued to. We have seen that wages haven't grown to match inflation for a very long time. And at the same time, housing prices have become more about investment and profiteering than about accommodation and living. And also we've seen a change in whose supposed to be responsible for those things. I've experienced executive governments say that that's not, if you're not experiencing a good life, it's because you're not trying hard enough. I think as Liz was saying, this shift of the responsibility from a communal responsibility to an individual responsibility, even as the factors that would make those chances possible are being pulled away, but because they've been experienced by the people who are telling us the story, it's still their reality, and they haven't lived the generational difference that we are experiencing. So I imagine for them, the story still rings true. But how that felt for me, I suppose, growing up was I've experienced economic security for the first time in my life last year, and I finally moved out of my parents' home in December. There are a few factors. I went to a private school and I went to university, and I couldn't find secure work until very recently. And even then, I would say my work is always short-term contracts, because most government investing in projects that are built to support and uplift the capacity of marginalized communities, including people with disabilities and people who are with diverse sexual orientation and gender and intersex variations, and people who live in those intersections of multiple disadvantage. We tend to, the projects are usually quite short term. So you'll have 6 months, you'll have 12 months, and in that time you're expected to try and change everything for a small community that is notoriously difficult to engage and to reach. It also has given me a lot of perspective on the way that privilege, in my case, my family's economic privilege, which is generational, has been able to shield me from significant disadvantages that are experienced by my peers, by other bisexual people, by non-binary people, by people who are autistic. That's another part. I was diagnosed as autistic at 25, which I think is an interesting thing to show through these kinds of long-term studies, because until that point, the only person to blame for my issues with work, with my issues with engaging and keeping jobs, with my issues with understanding the tax system and understanding how to start saving and to develop financial literacy were seen as personal failings, which also led to crippling mental health issues. I've been on antidepressants since I was 19. At the same time, I've been significantly discouraged from trying to access New Start for people at Centrelink themselves. I've had one incident when the first time I went on New Start where I called 35 times to finally get through because my appointment at a job agency had been cancelled. I needed to go to that appointment to receive any supports. And when I tried to call to find out what had happened, again, I was put on hold. When I finally got through on my 36th call, as you can see, I remember it very vividly, I was on hold for 4 hours. During that time, I traveled to the Centrelink office and waited in physical line. When I finally got through to somebody, I was then transferred and waited for a further 3 hours. And then I was told it had been a mistake and that they made a new appointment for me. And then I was hung up on. I went to that job agency and they had no work in my field, no work that matched my qualifications. And I never really heard from them again after they made my profile. So I just applied for any job I could find that was vaguely relevant in about 20 of those a month, I think is the requirement. So it's been a while. And again, once I was diagnosed as autistic, a lot of people ask me about NDIS, and I've done a lot of work on consultations with the National Disability Insurance Agency and with the Information and Capacity Linkages programs. I have been very fortunate and privileged in that I do not need to go onto the NDIS to survive at the moment. But also people's disbelief that I would need to is often, and that occurring within the NDIS itself is a massive disincentivization to try. As a lot of autistic people goes, I've significantly struggled with mental health for most of my life. And that has again been seen as due to personal, a lot of blaming attributed to myself for the lack of support needs that have been met and my lack of understanding of my own accommodation requirements, but also in a government that does still significantly treat disability as a hindrance and a burden on society. We've seen a 300% increase in people with NDIS plans challenging the governments, and we've also seen a significant amount of money being spent on private legal practices to defend those legal challenges. I suppose to finish, I know I've got a time limit and I struggle to keep track of time, my autistic brain, but I think of what, there's a quote that stuck with me by Margaret Mead, which was saying the first sign of a true civilized society was a broken and healed femur bone. And that showed that that someone who had broken their leg, something that is a death sentence for a lot of the people in the other creatures in the animal kingdom, that person had been carried and healed and cared for until they could recover. And I think about what kind of society we think we are now, where the idea of holding and helping people who have experienced disadvantage and have experienced harm, or who aren't able to fully be productive cogs in the machine, are they carried along or are they left to die in the road? And in my experience, there are a lot of people who've been left behind. There's a lot of pain and a lot of anger in those people. And there is a lot of understanding that at a time when we have seen no wage growth, we've got some of the highest paid politicians in the world. And I think that discrepancy can kind of be summed up as to how I feel often about this government and this executive governments I've lived under. I'll say it's a bit bitter that Scott Morrison is the first time I've seen a Prime Minister last a full term since I've been old enough to vote. So that's been part of it too. Being part of the studies also meant I've got to see what I thought when I was a child, and that can be in some ways bittersweet, because there were a lot of aspirations and dreams that I can barely remember anymore. But I think hope is something that you hold like an axe, and you wait for it to try and smash down doors as opposed to a lottery ticket. So I hold on to hope quite aggressively, even though I'm not sure about house ownership. I'm definitely not sure I'll be able to afford children. I still think there's a lot of things that we can change, and I'm quite determined to be part of that solution. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruby. And I think what's it's just you really highlighted the as did Liz too, the individual harms that are caused by policy choices over the last 30 years, which really affect people's well, their life chances and opportunities, but also their well-being and opportunity to live with dignity and autonomy. So turning this, opening up a bit to all of you. So what could we do from policy perspective to make a difference, not only between generations, but within generations to even up the odds? And I suppose a second part to that question is, how can we build intergenerational equity and solidarity and move away from the kind of generational conflicts that have been promoted? So who'd like to answer those questions or contribute to that discussion?
Go first. Definitely we need data. We can't really understand the problem or the magnitude of the problem without knowing some data. Without having data. That's not to say that we don't act in the absence of data, but at the moment, I think, and for a great lot of policy decision making, we've got quite a large evidence base to show what needs to be done. I mean, we know how to lift people out of poverty through social supports and so on. So it starts with data, but it also starts with leadership, unfortunately, from policymakers and politicians. Because without their decision making, it's going to be left to individuals to keep waging a war on inequality, and of course that's going to start to see that gap widen even more between the haves and the have-nots. So we need to have, I guess, a more of a push from ordinary people to hold leaders to account and to demand change.
So Roger, oh no, yeah. Okay, Ruby, welcome.
Thanks. Sorry, I know I think one of the things I think is to do as well with that sense of the people feeling like we can create change in politicians is significantly change in the idea of personal accountability in politics. We see the steadfast refusal for things like a federal corruption investigation commission. I haven't got that right, but the ICAC. We've also seen just even with things like Christian Porter, a complete refusal to take any sense of responsibility being something we do. And I feel again like that's part of Australia's story. We really struggle to accept the responsibility for wrongdoing and recognize it's not about us being bad people. It's about mistakes being made, but also owning what we are and what we are responsible for. And I think that's kind of also part of the age that stays in power. Intergenerational conversations are very difficult because as soon as again, to use the name of this conference, millennials and boomers, right? There is that kind of sense of when we start talking about issues with rising inequity and significant issues breaking into the housing market that are different to what our parents face. Not to say that, I've had in some ways I've had more opportunities than my mother got. My mother had more opportunities than her mother got. However, there's differences. And I think the issue is that me even saying that is seen as me accusing a whole generation of people of deliberately disadvantaging me. And that's not what we're talking about. And I think that's where part of those issues are, is to acknowledge that there is rising inequalities, to say something's gone wrong, what you're doing isn't working. And I think that's not something that we've seen a lot of willingness to accept by our governments for a long time. I think studies like this, in fact, which is always ironic given how much evaluation and reporting you have to do for even very small grants from any level of government. I've had to spend so much time. I have 8 months and 45K to try and create systemic change. And I have to spend a lot of that on academic evaluations. And yet when we have these long-term evaluations and investigations that will give, that show the actual impact of policy, the actual success or failure of policy to create change, it's brushed aside as inconvenient. And I think that's something as well that we struggle with. And as those gaps between what we expect from politicians and what we get change, people get very disenfranchised and disinterested. And I think that's what we're struggling with now, is that Australia has compulsory voting, something I'm a big fan of, but it is hard for people when they do feel that they're all bastards. And I think that's a really difficult thing to move past. Excuse my language. I'm not here for my job, so I feel like I can say these things a bit more easily.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ruby. What about your thoughts, Roger?
Yeah, I mean, I have nothing to offer on how we can shift the political situation and change the political dynamics and the political calculus that's going on. But what I would say is I think there's two broad categories, particularly at the federal level, where we should be looking at policy. Firstly, my judgment is that we've spent the last 30 odd years chipping away at the system of social protection that was really largely built up in the 70s and 80s. And so that obviously includes the income support system, which has really, governments of both persuasions seem to be hell bent on undermining, despite its incredible popularity with the general population. But it also extends to things like our health and education systems, even the justice system, and it's a comprehensive suite where I think we've just seen governments chipping away. So it's death by 1,000 cuts. There's not really there's been a few signature moments where you could say, that was a drastic change, but mostly it's been very. So I think we need to really try to reinvest, as I think that was the term that Janet might have used, reinvesting in our system of social protection. The other type of policies I think we need to be thinking about are the ones that are actually contributing to the problem, that that are exacerbating inequalities. And in that sort of category, I would put the large subsidies that are going to private schools, which is just, and I have, at admission, I am a beneficiary of those, both as a student and as a parent. But I can see that it's bad for society. It's exacerbating and perpetuating inequalities, and it just should go. And it's a crazy system we've got. Subsidizing private health insurance, silly again. Invest in the public system. Superannuation, I think this is a real blind spot for the Labor Party. It is causing, its existence and its tax treatment is exacerbating inequalities in our community, and it really needs a real rethink. Related to that, I think we have to. The tax system should really be much more blind to your age. The idea that you can check out of the tax system when you hit so-called retirement age, is wrong-headed. If you're rich as a retiree, you should be paying tax in the same way as you're rich as a young person. And so again, so these are the sorts of things where I think policies are not addressing problems; they're actually exacerbating them.
Yeah, absolutely, Roger. Now, I think Ursula wanted to give her perspective too about what perhaps could be done, and then I'll turn to audience questions.
Yes, thanks, Dina, and thanks a lot to all the panelists as well, because I think one of the things that's really been highlighted is the importance of, as Liz said, the importance of data and evidence, and I think also the importance of stories that Janet talked about at the start, but the story gets beyond those essentialised kind of categories of boomers and millennials and shows us that there are so many versions of lived experience, and inequity and inequality kind of lurks around lots of different corners for different people. And like Roger, I don't necessarily have lots of answers, but I think one of the things, we do live in a rich country. We are very high up on the list of very rich countries, and yet what we fail to have is long-term policy vision that lifts people out of poverty traps. We have very short-term, we have deliberate policies that keep people poor and in poverty traps. And of course, we've seen that with the income support system. But I guess one more thing I'd just really like to add is that women in particular are hard done by perhaps, or pushed into economic insecurity, often by, particularly I was very disappointed about Labor not supporting the payment of superannuation during paid parental leave. And I think often for women, when they become parents, they either have to leave work, or they come back to work on a part-time basis. And our paid parental leave policies don't support both parents, if there are two parents, to care for their children and share the roles. We in some ways, we're stuck in those old social norms about mothers being the ones who take on the primary caring roles and who also give up their jobs at the time when they've got young children. And I think that women's role in their care economy is not recognised appropriately, and we need to have proper social investment in social infrastructure so that women have much better and more secure employment in those industries. But I also think in industries like the community services sector, which Ruby works in, and also in the arts, which is very undervalued, I think, in Australia.
Yeah, good points, Ursula. And certainly one of the things we saw with the Life Chances study is just the persistence of those gendered patterns about care and work. And that's not because people want to do that necessarily, but it's the way in which the policies sort of force people into those roles, and so and kind of work against more equal sharing. Now I'm going to turn to some of the questions, and we'll see what we've got. We've got a few questions here. There's one question here, and I don't know who would like to answer it. Have you seen evidence of an increase in family violence as a result or related to the bank of mum and dad, for example, elder abuse? Would anyone like to have a go at answering that question? Liz?
I think it's difficult to put a number on it, a statistic on it, but I would suggest that it stands to reason that as we're seeing an increasing reliance on the so-called bank of mum and dad, and the way that we're, I guess we're seeing also multi-generational households live together to accommodate the need to overcome housing affordability issues, that there is the potential for that to occur is increasing. And I mean, we've got a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that that yes, the financial elder abuse is occurring, but it would be interesting to know specifically, particularly as a bank goes through this process, to actually do their due diligence to confirm that actually it's a safe process. And so I definitely think there's a role of banks there to do some checking.
Anyone else like to have a go at commenting on that question?
I guess I just also discuss, we know that when there's financial dependence, there's a higher risk for abuse. And I think that also can, when we look at that for young people, particularly for young people who are queer, there's actually an increased risk of abuse from families that is ongoing if you can't leave the home, and if you can't move out and find alternate accommodation that is safe and secure. And I think as well, when we look at people experiencing homelessness, we don't tend to look at people who, like, one reasons as to why we do find that, at least for LGBTIQ plus people, that's an issue. And we also know that with people with disabilities, there's very, very high issues there with familial abuse, particularly again because of financial dependency and the burden of, and what is seen as the burden of care, and the way that's often framed as well, which is to be seen as kind of often framed in media as when we do see quite high levels of parents actually just killing young people with disabilities within their families, it's kind of framed still as mercy. And so I think that sense of the expectation of children, adult children included, to respect or to kind of adhere to families is also something that is kind of staying in those traditional generational gaps. And we are seeing as well the persistence of both women and gay men being expected to be carers for their families because of having less of their own relationships that they can invest in. So I suppose just wanted to add that it's complicated, but I think any time that there is financial dependence, there is potential for abuse of dependence. And so as these things increase, people are also able to make less comfortable choices about what they want for their own lives, because if their parents are paying, as someone again who lived with my parents up until my 30s, I love being able to choose what I have for dinner. That's really nice. I'm 31 and I'm learning what that's like. It's those kinds of things where it is also, there's a level of learned helplessness that can be difficult to break through when you understand that at a certain point when you're arguing with your parents, they'll say, my house, my rules. And that's kind of, and that's fine. But again, my family are very supportive, but that can be very restrictive and make it difficult. And that restriction can also mean people are more susceptible or vulnerable to engaging in other abusive relationships outside of their family, if that's become a normalized way.
Yeah, thanks, Ruby. And I wondered, it kind of relates to another question here, which is, and maybe Roger can answer this first, is that prolongation of dependency, which is often associated with, increased education. We've seen a more highly educated population, particularly for women who are completing a tertiary education. But how is this translated in terms of economic security? Could you comment on that?
Well, yes, at an individual level, education is more important than ever, and we are doing more of it than ever, but it's not as protective or as particularly for young adults as it once was. So now we're seeing more and more people graduate, but more and more of those graduates are not, at least they're taking longer and longer to get full-time employment. Whether it remains to be seen how that sort of plays out longer term. I suspect that the long-standing advantages to education will, to some extent, persist, and the relative decline in new graduates' outcomes, that may not persist into later adulthood. That ultimately these graduates will find relatively good jobs and so on. But it's become more of a, I suppose it's probably fair to say it's become more of an imperative for young people than it was previously, and that means that we've got, for example, more and more of a population who have significant debt from the university fees, the HECS fees, and that's probably also contributing to, I guess, delaying the transition to traditional markers of adulthood, marriage, children, home ownership. It certainly can't be helping.
What about you, Liz? You talked about education being a way that helped to kind of build a life. But you also mentioned that you probably won't ever own a home, so it's not a neat equation.
No, and certainly, you know, in decades past, that we could plot an equation that would show as education increases, life outcomes will also be more beneficial, and we can still do that to a degree on a range of indicators, and certainly people with a higher level of education tend to do well generally. But what we're seeing now is almost like there's a misstep between policy and practice, whereby we've got policies in Australia that are baked in and very little change has occurred, just a bit of tinkering on the sides. So policy in Australia has baked in a traditional view of the past. And so because we've not changed policy much, we don't like reform generally in Australia, we don't tend to vote for it. We've got that issue on one hand, and on the other side we've got this massive social change whereby women are engaging in higher education at higher rates than men, for example. Yet we're seeing this kind of disconnect between outcomes that we would traditionally see or we'd expect to see, because of what I'm seeing over here of the kind of the policy aspects that bake in this traditional notion of family, traditional notion of gender. And so it's actually, I would suggest, policy holding us back. And for me, if I look at my life without education, and I say this without any irony or without trying to cause shock, I would have died in a ditch somewhere. I'm certain of it, right? And that's, you know, drug use would have certainly been a feature and so on. Education was that one thing that gave me the ability to walk the talk, to, you know, to even sound like I could be presentable. Every now and again, I kind of give in to the twang of the, you know, the Westie in me. And there was one interview I did with Patricia Carvelis once, and I was really fatigued. It was at the end of the day, and the yobbo just came through in flying colours. And that's something I still mask. I still mask that accent so that I can fit in and not be seen for my, you know, for that class that I experienced. So what does that all mean? Well, we need to move away from the baked in problems that we're seeing in policy, because it's not keeping up with contemporary Australia.
Now we're almost out of time.
Can I just quickly, I wanted to,
yes, Ruby.
I think that idea of, again, recognizing the few factors that meant that I did not end up homeless and with severe mental health issues that I was treating, that were untreated. And so I was resorting to, I mean, I still have issues with substance abuse, as a lot of my queer communities do, and a lot of people with autistic people do, sorry. And I just want to also add the idea of what respectability is, and the idea of professionalism, and who is allowed into those hallowed halls and whose voices matter, and how much work it takes to mold ourselves into people that can be treated with some level of respect or are seen as worthy, people have to recognize the effort that's taking and where that mold has come from, and the refusal to change it. Because I think that the idea of what a normal person is in Australia and what diversity means is still very much based on, so I'm using air quotes for people who have vision impairments, but it still means that any experience that is beyond that of a white, cis, straight man is still treated as less real and less deserving. And we see that in the reflection of our governments. We see that in our governments, like, you know, like hard, stubborn refusal to really take issues of gender inequity and abuse seriously. And I think, again, we just see Australia's refusal as a country often to question the narrative that we're fair, despite the outcoming things showing that we actually have very entrenched issues with race, with gender, with disability, with sexual orientation, and as we're seeing now with the push with transgender people and with difference. And we don't like change. And then when we have the change, we like to pretend it was always like that. And I think until we can really look at how that happens in education and how that happens in the stories we tell each other as a country about who we are, it's very difficult to expect it to be different.
Thanks, Ruby. Now we are out of time. It's a fascinating conversation. We could keep on going for a lot longer because we only touched the surface. But if you're interested in keeping the conversation going, use the hashtag on Twitter, BSL Talks. And to learn more about the Brotherhood of St. Laurence, our work, and get a recording of this video, visit our website, bsl.org.au, and the information's up there on the screen. Thanks so much for a fascinating discussion. Bye.
Thank you.